Yeah, hi everyone. Sorry? Okay, thank you. Yeah, when it came time to decide what kind of talk to do this year at FOSDEM, I didn't have any good idea. But happened that at around that time there were various Garrett patches that had issues with something that sounds as trivial as URL handling. So I told these poor people that had the issues what exactly they had to, which functions exactly they had to use, where and what parameters exactly to pass in so that it would work. And yeah, this is something that is decades old by now. The code has morphed through various stages, but still is in apparently a shape so that whenever somebody wants to use it, it's difficult. It's for one probably difficult because these issues are on the surface rather trivial, but then if you dig deeper they are difficult, but also because we fucked this up somewhat over the years, or I fucked up much of it, so I feel privileged to talk about it. And so here we are. A URL or URI, something rather trivial. So I'll only talk about the textual manipulation of these things within LibreOffice, not the other issue of you have an URI and that points at some document somewhere on the internet and you want to get the content out of it. That's not the thing we are talking about here. The even more trivial part of assembling these, passing them around, reading them in. So what's a URI? There's an RFC for that. It has some components, a scheme, some authority part with maybe user info. Much of that can be left out. You may have a query and a fragment. And at some point in time during the formalization of that, there were various RFCs over the time that formalized this and improved this. And at some point in time, there was a concept of having a URI reference that also included the fragment. By now, the URI is the whole thing, including the fragment. But this jargon of calling this a URI reference, the whole thing, including that fragment, optional fragment part there, that still shines through in our URI. So I thought I clarify why we have these funny-looking functions that I'll talk about later. Now, let's go back in time to late 90s, last century. I just started in a company called StarOffice. No, Star Division actually, doing StarOffice development. We had our own thing to handle these URLs, INET URL object. Of course, it didn't use all these wonderful standardized names. It just had invented its own completely different set of function names. So you have a getParam for getParameter, that's the query part. getMark gives you the fragment part. It even doesn't talk about schemes, but about protocols. And there was a fixed enum list of protocols that we knew, and everything else we would say that's not a URL, that's invalid. So if you had a HTTPS URL, wouldn't have something like that at that time. Plus, it was horrible in that it insisted on, I know what this specification is. I mean, it didn't know what the specification is, else it wouldn't have called it getParam, but getQuery. But on the other hand, it said, I do know that there's things you need to write in this way or in that way. So it always tried to normalize all your input into the one form that it believed is the right one or the canonical one. And back then also, back in the late 90s, there was still some web servers out there that had their own quirks. And for example, it might have been some Kaputten web server that wanted a URL written this way, where it didn't want it to have an exclamation point, but wanted that for whatever weird reason be encoded with this percent encoding that is standard for URLs. So you have an exclamation point, this ASCII number 21 in hex, so this is %21 there. But if you entered this into the hyperlink dialog in StarOffice back then or LibreOffice today, what would happen is that internally we would rewrite that as the canonical URL with a exclamation point there, and that's what then goes over the wire to that HTTP server. By now, most servers are working well, so this issue that was quite a pain point back then has more or less vanished. The code is still as broken as it was back then, our code, but the code outside, the web server code, has gotten much better over the years or decades, so that's no longer that much of an issue. Another funny issue with this is that, as I said, this URL object knew a fixed set of schemas, of URL schemes, and parsed these and understood what exactly they would need to look like. And for file URLs, which are quite common when you work with your local files or pass your files to some other application or want to invoke some Java functionality on your files, and then you pass around file URLs. And this init URL object still insists on file URLs having 3 slashes because there needs to be this authority component, even if it is empty, or it could also be localhost. But in the RFC, of course, you can leave it out. In our implementation, it still has to be spelled out at these 2 funny slashes. And when Java creates a file URL, for example, it always uses this. When you then pass into LibreOffice, for example, ask it on the command line to open that, then it used to do this. I think we're by now clever enough to, or there were also other reasons why we need to map back and forth file URLs. I'll come to that later, and I think by now we handle this special thing there as well. So a URL is the syntax like these 2 slashes for the authority part, even if it is not there in the file URL. And the other part of it is the kind of payload data that's included there, which again seems rather trivial. For example, there's a data URL format, and what you can encode with a data URL is pure data bytes, octets in RFC speak. So each data item corresponds to an ASCII letter, or the other way around. Each ASCII letter corresponds to some data item. So you have 4 data items here in this data URL. The comma is syntax part, meta syntax part. So you have an A, a B, a C, and a space, and they correspond to these 4 bytes. And the B you can also write as this person encoding stuff, and the space you need to write as a person 20 encoding, because spaces are not allowed in URLs. So this is easy. You have some stuff, and you decode it into bytes. For a file URL, what the payload is of course a file path or a path name on your system. And the simple case again is quite simple. A foobar butts on Linux is a foobar butts on path name there. What is less clear is if you have some non-ASCII characters in your path name, how do you construct the URL for that? Back in those days we were talking about, that wasn't that clear. By now, again, thank you to the outside world, everybody moved to UTF-8, so by now it is quite clear that you want to encode this umlaut as the corresponding UTF-8 characters, and then encode that into the URL. Back then, there were still, especially on Windows, lots of different encoding systems in use. By now, Windows moved to the 16-bit path names, so this is even easier by now. But back then, it was tricky how to do this conversation, and you would sometimes do it right, and sometimes would be done wrong, or it just wouldn't work. And what made this even more problematic is still back late. Well, I think we're still in the 90s. Star Office wanted to go into this brave new world of Unicode. I mean, we were a text processing application first and foremost, and there was this new Unicode thing, and that needed to be embraced on all levels, not only typing text, but the whole UI thing, everything. Suddenly, Unicode is the thing to go. Before that, it had been easy. We had one string class, of course, our own one, handwritten, of course. And URLs were written as strings, and if you took something out or combined some strings into a URL, everything was easy and dandy. Then we had two string classes, one for the old code that had not yet been transformed into the new world, and another one for the new code that was a UTF-16 Java-inspired Unistring class, and the URLs, of course, because we were transitioning the code, there were also cases of either URLs using old 8-bit and new 16-bit strings. And so now the problem starts. If you want to get out a 16-bit Unicode string out of this, you want to get the payload out of this, the file path, the path name out of this thing. It's not only interesting that this is maybe a 16-bit string that you pass into the URL object, but also the individual bytes represented by this. You now also need to think about you have bytes here in the payload, like in the data URL I showed earlier. So this is just byte. But what you want to have out of this is this unistring that wants to work on 16-bit units. So how do you do that? There's different ways, and again, depending on your needs, sometimes the one way is the right one, sometimes the other is the right one. So what might happen here is, depending on how you do it, you get out some rather different strings, and that's what started to show up back then. So the easy cases of this transition to the wonderful Unicode world were easy, because if you had your foobar txt, then that kept working by magic because there's no strange characters in there. But in other cases, it started to get messy. And the other messy thing is that by then, I had become the maintainer of that dreaded class. And what made it even more messy is, back then, late 90s, the way we built the Star Office is not as today. So you do a change on LibreOffice, you do a grep over the source code, you change things all over the place, you do a make check, and half an hour later, you're done? No. Back then, if you wanted to do a change, you had to write a mail. Dear colleagues, you didn't do that. It was called a Muss-Änderung, a change that must be done, an important change that everybody must do. Otherwise, the whole thing wouldn't compile on the next compile. The next compile was not done by you on your desktop machine, but was done by a special group of engineers that built that thing. And if somebody had either not declared that something needed to be changed everywhere, or somebody else had not done that change, then everything would break, of course. And so you wouldn't do these changes yourself all over the place. So I would never have been allowed into the writer code to do these changes there. The writer people said, what? You want to do a change there? But that's work for us, and that's lots of work. We can't do that. So forget it. Yeah, but I needed to get this change into the code some way, so that they wouldn't notice and wouldn't be too angry with me for all the work I imposed on them. So what did I do? I just to all these functions in this dreaded URL object class, I added some more parameters. But I added them as defaulted parameters so that nobody would notice. Had to be creative with what the parameters did, because as I showed on the previous slide, depending on whether you want the one or the other output, for the foobar txt example, without any Unicode, it all works fine. But if you come to the fine point, then it's very important which one you choose. So I had to choose one for each of these functions, and I, of course, guessed wrong for most of the cases. But initially, nobody noticed, because for the easy cases of a foobar txt, everything continued to work. So I saved my ass with that, and only shoveled the hard parts under the rugs. And that's where we are still today. So when today somebody has a Garrett patch that doesn't quite work, and I need to tell them exactly which parameters to stuff in where, that's because 20 years ago I shoveled that under the rug. So what are these wonderful, strange parameters? So whenever you want to get something into or out of a URL object, some text, you need to decide what these bytes actually, or how you want to represent these bytes, and whether you want to, if you have a complete URL, for example, there is a function getMain_URL that gives you out the complete URL again, canonicalized, of course, because that's what this thing does. If there's this strange file with a 10% $20 file name, whatever that should mean, then it is encoded in the file as a 10% 2520, because the percent sign itself needs to be encoded as %25. So when you want to get this URL back, you still want this syntax there, and not have it decoded. So there's a function getMain_URL that gives you the whole URL back, and that takes a decode mechanism. This is this thing that I defaulted to something, and I have 4 different ways to get this thing back. This is either decode nothing, or decode to an internationalized URI that is with umlauts intact. And there's this with charset that decodes everything, despite the name being somewhat vague, but it's really a blow up in this case. And then there's this unambiguous that came later only, because of too many problems. And if you use this blow up with charset thing, which would have been the standard, then everything would have been decoded. So this would have been the output, with a $25 is an encoding of a person sign. So you decode this part to this, then comes the 20, then comes the $. So this still looks like a file URL, but it's a file URL for something rather different, because that's the file $10, not 10% $20. Because this %20, if you interpret this as a file, this whole thing as a file URL, then this %20 means a space character. So that's the place, that's the situation where we got stuck. And then also, what also happened is that we created some very inventive uses of URLs as well. One of them was this, won't go into that, macro expanding stuff that generates URLs from other URLs or URL-looking things. And we had this package thing, because now ODF came onto the scene, and we have these zip files with the sub-content, and we need to have files into the zip, but we also need to describe the original zip file itself. So we have these package URLs that include as authority a whole URL encoded. So you have a file URL, and all the slashes need to be encoded, and all the percents in there need to be encoded. And if you want to take that out again, you have to be careful to take it out in the right way with the right decode mechanism parameter, or else everything blows up, which is the typical case of problems where we still get these Garrett patches that don't quite work. So what did we do? At this time, we all knew this enet URL object is just not going to work for that. So we invented some stuff. So this is, now we're into the 2000s, early 2000s. The bubble is at its height. So I rewrote all this, or started to rewrite all this stuff in which was also a bad idea in retrospect, because is the thing that once you have written something in it or defined something, you cannot change it anymore because backwards compatibility with your extensions. So I was very careful to not add too much nonsense that we would carry on forever. So what we do have there by now is rather little or close to nothing with very weird names, because that was the time when this URI reference thing was en vogue in the RFC world. So I copied that from there eagerly. Now we have some very funny looking stuff with very long names that can do this conversation, but again, only if you know exactly how to write your 20 lines of code. So people don't do that either. So still ask me in their Garrett patches how to get help for that. And we can change that because can't be changed. So yeah, wasn't that bright of an idea either. So here we are, 20 years later, still having fun with this. Thank you. And I hope there's no actual questions or Garrett patches at this time.
You are still responsible.
No. Sorry?
Questions for Stefan?
Thank you.